Saul was the first king of Israel. He was the son of Kish of the family of the Matrites and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2, TLB. Kish was a rich, influential man from the tribe of Benjamin. He was the son of Abel, grandson of Zeror, great-grandson of Becherath, and great-great-grandson of Aphiah. His son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, and he was head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Saul was anointed by the prophet Samuel and was made king by the league of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it over Saul's head and kissed him on the cheek and said, "I am doing this because the Lord has appointed you to be the king of his people, Israel." And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he too began to prophesy. When his friends heard about it, they exclaimed, "What, Saul a prophet?" And one of the neighbors added, "With a father like his?" So that is the origin of the proverb, "Is Saul a prophet too?" Samuel now called a convocation of all Israel at Mizpah and gave them this message from the Lord God. "I brought you from Egypt and rescued you from the Egyptians and from all of the nations that were torturing you. But although I have done so much for you, you have rejected me and have said, 'We want a king instead.' All right then, present yourselves before the Lord by tribes and clans." So Samuel called the tribal leaders together before the Lord, and the tribe of Benjamin was chosen by sacred lot. Then he brought each family of the tribe of Benjamin before the Lord, and the family of the Matrites was chosen. And finally, the sacred lot selected Saul, the son of Kish. But when they looked for him, he had disappeared. So they asked the Lord, "Where is he? Is he here among us?" And the Lord replied, "He is hiding in the baggage." So they found him and brought him out, and he stood head and shoulders above everyone else. Then Samuel said to all the people, "This is the man the Lord has chosen as your king. There isn't his equal in all of Israel." And all the people shouted, "Long live the king." 1 Samuel 10, 1 through 24, TLB. Saul had good military leadership abilities, which he used within his time as king. Saul acted more as a judge of Israel than a monarch. He was a transitional figure between the old order and the new way of life among a people composed of different elements and leading figures. His act as king was to defend the people of Israel against the Philistines and enemies. Saul's reign as king was destined to come to swift end when he started disobeying God and his prophet Samuel. The first of many instances was in 1 Samuel 12, where Saul performed a sacrifice for a burnt offering when it was meant to be done by the priest or prophet. Then Jonathan attacked and destroyed the garrison of the Philistines at Geba. The news spread quickly throughout the land of the Philistines, and Saul sounded the call to arms throughout Israel. He announced that he had destroyed the Philistine garrison and warned his men that the army of Israel stank to high heaven as far as the Philistines were concerned. So the entire Israeli army mobilized again and joined at Gilgal. The Philistines recruited a mighty army of 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and so many soldiers that they were as thick as sand along the seashore. And they camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw the vast mass of enemy troops, they lost their nerve entirely and tried to hide in caves, thickets, coverts, among the rocks, and even in tombs and cisterns. Some of them crossed the Jordan River and escaped to the land of Gad and Gilead. Meanwhile, Saul stayed at Gilgal, and those that were with him trembled with fear at what awaited them. Samuel had told Saul earlier to wait 7 days for his arrival, but when he still didn't come, and Saul's troops were rapidly slipping away, he decided to sacrifice the burnt offering and the peace offerings himself. But just as he was finishing, Samuel arrived. Saul went out to meet him and to receive his blessing. But Samuel said, "What is this you have done?" "Well," Saul replied, "when I saw that my men were scattering from me, and that you hadn't arrived by the time you said you would, and that the Philistines were at Michmash, ready for battle, I said, 'The Philistines are ready to march against us, and I haven't even asked for the Lord's help.' So I reluctantly offered the burnt offering without waiting for you to arrive." "You fool," Samuel exclaimed. "You have disobeyed the commandment of the Lord your God. He was planning to make you and your descendants king of Israel forever, but now your dynasty must end. For the Lord wants a man who will obey him, and he has discovered the man he wants and has already appointed him as king over his people. For you have not obeyed the Lord's commandment." 1 Samuel 12, 3-14 TLB. Saul also disobeyed God when he was commanded to kill the Amalekites and every living thing they possessed, but did not and lied about it. One day Samuel said to Saul, "It was the Lord who told me to anoint you as king of his people, Israel. Now listen to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord of Heaven's armies has declared. I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys." So Saul mobilized his army at Telaim. There were 200,000 soldiers from Israel and 10,000 men from Judah. Then Saul and his army went to a town of the Amalekites and lay in wait in the valley. Saul sent this warning to the Kenites, "Move away from where the Amalekites live, or you will die with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up from Egypt." So the Kenites packed up and left. Then Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, east of Egypt. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats, the cattle, the fat calves, and the lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or of poor quality. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "I am sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me and has refused to obey my command." Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. Early the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him, Saul went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Then he went on to Gilgal. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. "May the Lord bless you," he said. "I have carried out the Lord's command." "Then what is all the bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle I hear?" Samuel demanded. "It's true that the army spared the best of the sheep, goats, and cattle," Saul admitted. "But they are going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. We have destroyed everything else." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop. Listen to what the Lord told me last night." "What did he tell you?" Saul asked. And Samuel told him, "Although you think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, 'Go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they are all dead.' Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul insisted. "I carried out the mission he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. Then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and plunder to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." But Samuel replied, "What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. 1 Samuel 15, 1-23 NLT. These acts of disobedience displeased God, hence leading to the anointing of David as king. After Samuel died, Saul was to fight the Philistine and inquired of the Lord about the upcoming war, but God was not answering him. So he summoned a witch, the witch of Endor. Meanwhile, Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him. He was buried in Ramah, his hometown. And Saul had banned from the land of Israel all mediums and those who consult the spirits of the dead. The Philistines set up their camp at Shunem, and Saul gathered all the army of Israel and camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the vast Philistine army, he became frantic with fear. He asked the Lord what he should do, but the Lord refused to answer him, either by dreams or by sacred lots or by the prophets. Saul then said to his advisors, "Find a woman who is a medium, so I can go and ask her what to do." His advisors replied, "There is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself by wearing ordinary clothing instead of his royal robes. Then he went to the woman's home at night, accompanied by 2 of his men. "I have to talk to a man who has died," he said. "Will you call up his spirit for me?" "Are you trying to get me killed?" the woman demanded. "You know that Saul has outlawed all the mediums and all who consult the spirits of the dead. Why are you setting a trap for me?" But Saul took an oath in the name of the Lord and promised, "As surely as the Lord lives, nothing bad will happen to you for doing this." Finally, the woman said, "Well, whose spirit do you want me to call up?" "Call up Samuel," Saul replied. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, "You've deceived me. You are Saul." "Don't be afraid," the king told her. "What do you see?" "I see a god coming up out of the earth," she said. "What does he look like?" Saul asked. "He is an old man wrapped in a robe," she replied. Saul realized it was Samuel, and he fell to the ground before him. "Why have you disturbed me by calling me back?" Samuel asked Saul. "Because I'm in deep trouble," Saul replied. "The Philistines are at war with me, and God has left me and won't reply by prophets or dreams. So I have called for you to tell me what to do." But Samuel replied, "Why ask me, since the Lord has left you and has become your enemy? The Lord has done just as he said he would. He has torn the kingdom from you and given it to your rival, David. The Lord has done this to you today because you refused to carry out his fierce anger against the Amalekites. What's more, the Lord will hand you and the army of Israel over to the Philistines tomorrow, and you and your sons will be here with me. The Lord will bring down the entire army of Israel in defeat." Saul fell full length on the ground, paralyzed with fright because of Samuel's words. He was also faint with hunger, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. When the woman saw how distraught he was, she said, "Sir, I obeyed your command at the risk of my life. Now do what I say, and let me give you a little something to eat so you can regain your strength for the trip back." But Saul refused to eat anything. Then his advisors joined the woman in urging him to eat, so he finally yielded and got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had been fattening a calf, so she hurried out and killed it. She took some flour, kneaded it into dough, and baked unleavened bread. She brought the meal to Saul and his advisors, and they ate it. Then they went out into the night. 1 Samuel 28, 3-24 NLT. The aftermath of this encounter was that Saul died in the battle, and his sons with him, except for one, Ishbosheth, who ruled for a short time after his father's death. The Bible tells us about another Saul, but his own story took a different tangent. Click here to watch the story of Saul, later known as Apostle Paul.